Galatians we're in chapter 4. And we have learned a few things, I hope, as we've gone through Galatians. I hope we've been able to see some important truths about Galatians, because it's one of those books that is so often misunderstood. It's one of those that's so often used to combat what might be our perspective. People think that this teaches against where we're at, meeting on Shabbat, doing the things that we do, and in fact it's quite the opposite. So we've learned a few things already. We looked at the timeline of things, about how Paul started his life as a believer on the Damascus Road. He talked about the events that happened just in a few years after that occurrence in chapter 1. He went on his missionary journey. He visits Antioch. He has this confrontation with Peter. And so then they go to Jerusalem to see James and the others in Jerusalem. Coming to Acts 15 and the Jerusalem Council, and how they were waiting for a decision, or wanting to get a decision on the issue about salvation. Do the Gentiles, do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to go through that legal process of conversion to Judaism to be in agreement with and be under the terms of the Mosaic or the Sinai Covenant before they can be eligible to come to Messiah, before they can be eligible for the promises and salvation that is there? And they made a decision there at the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. And so they sent a letter to the various churches that were trying to get this issue resolved with Paul and some other witnesses. So he would go around to the churches and read this letter. He would go on his second missionary journey back out to Galatia. He would tell them this good news about how the Gentiles are to be included in Messiah. But then there were these legalistic believers who were coming along behind him after he had gone. They didn't accept the ruling, or they didn't know. And they insisted that the Gentiles have to keep the Torah first in order to be saved, in order to be justified. And we've been talking about how that's out of order. We've looked at things like this, Galatians 2:16. Yet we know that a person is set right not by deeds based on Torah, but rather through putting trust in Messiah Yeshua. So even we have put our trust in Messiah Yeshua in order that we might be set right based on trust in Messiah and not by deeds based on the Torah, because no human, Jew or Gentile, will be justified by the deeds based on the Torah. And we learn that the Mosaic Covenant, does not supersede, it does not invalidate or overrule the Abrahamic Covenant. He says this, in chapter 3, says, "What I'm saying is this: Torah, which came 430 years later, 430 years after the promise, 430 years after that first agreement, that first covenant with Abraham, it does not cancel the covenant previously confirmed by God so as to make the promise ineffective." And we've learned that God always intended to bless the Gentiles, to justify them in Messiah in the same way that he justified Abraham and blessed him. It's through Messiah Yeshua, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles. So we've learned that both Jew and Gentile, they have to be saved and justified the same way, through Messiah Yeshua. And so as a result of that truth, of that Paul is trying to hammer home, both Jew and Gentile in Messiah, both of them are to be considered descendants of Abraham and receivers of that promise. He says, "For you are all sons of God through trusting in Messiah Yeshua. For all of you who were immersed in Messiah have clothed yourselves with Messiah. So there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one. You are all counted. You are all eligible in Messiah Yeshua. And if you belong to Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And that's an important truth that needs to be maintained. Here we are, or last time in Galatians, we talked about putting the covenants in their proper order for the believer, whether you're Jew or Gentile. For the Jew, the Jewish person, the Torah was supposed to lead them to Messiah, help them to recognize the Messiah. But without Messiah, Torah condemned them as lawbreakers in the same situation as a Gentile. You're justified by faith. You're saved by believing the promised Messiah under the Abrahamic Covenant. And the Mosaic Covenant is God's instructions to a saved people, to a redeemed people, how his saved people are supposed to live. So the Mosaic Covenant, we've talked about it being that covenant of sanctification. The Abrahamic Covenant is the covenant of justification. The Mosaic Covenant is the covenant of sanctification. And so the Jews who have been living the Torah all their lives, they still need the Messiah to justify them before God. And the Gentiles who've grown up in paganism, guess what? We need Messiah to justify us before God, to bring us in. And then we also need the Torah to be trained to live a life that is pleasing to God. And so in chapter 4, Paul continues to teach them why getting the order of the covenants correct is so important. And he uses the idea of Hagar and Sarah. But before we get there, he starts with an example of his interactions with the Gentiles in verse 12. And it's important because this is one of those passages that I've seen used against what we're doing. He says, I plead with you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you. Y'all ever heard this one in conversation before? See, this is another one of those statements that's so often misunderstood or misused, because in no way does this statement mean that Paul set aside his Jewishness, set aside his Jewish lifestyle, and in no way does it mean that he adopted a Gentile way of life in order to reach them. That's how I've heard this passage talked about, how I've heard it used. Say, well, Paul, he became a Gentile in order to win, in order to lead them to Messiah. But that's not what this means. What it's talking about is, Paul, there was a divide between Jew and Gentile. Yes, we can all agree on that. And what he is saying is, Paul stepped across that divide that existed between Jew and Gentile in order to reach them. And when Paul stepped across that divide, how was that received by his fellow Jewish people? Did they like it? No, a lot of them did not. So Paul endured criticism. He endured ridicule. He endured accusation and misunderstanding from other Jewish people because he was identifying, he was becoming like them. He was crossing that divide and siding with them, identifying with them, advocating for the Gentile. And I have no doubt in my mind that he was probably called a Gentile, accused of that, a Gentile sinner by those who sought to discredit him. You're speaking against the temple. You're speaking against this place. How many times did those kind of accusations come up in the book of Acts? So Paul became like a Gentile in the eyes of other Jewish people, an object of scorn, an object of rejection. But notice that that's not the goal. The goal is not how it's often used in conversation, see, Paul became a Gentile so that we can all stay in our Gentile way of life and we don't have to worry about changing anything about us. That's not the goal. Even if that description was correct, which it's not, him becoming like them is not the end where they're going to stay, right? What's the end of this statement? What's really the goal in this statement? This is the end point. Become like me. What Paul is saying is, you Gentiles, I crossed that line. I've endured that scorn to reach you. But you Gentiles become like me. Follow my example as a Jewish man. Like we had a few weeks ago. Take hold of my tzitzit and come with me, and I'll show you how to live. I will disciple you to be a believer in Yeshua who knows about the things that may be foreign to you. Things like the Shabbat, things like the Torah. What are the feasts? What do they mean? How do we keep them? How do we walk in this set-apart life? Become like me, he is telling the Gentiles. So he wants them to know that that is the future that he wants for them. And so with that, he bears them no ill will. He bears them no blame for how he has been treated. He doesn't blame them for that. He blames that false teaching and that misunderstanding. But then he reminds them of how that whole connection even got started in the first place. He says, you have done me no wrong. The fault is not with you guys in this confusion and in this situation. He says, it was because of a physical ailment that I proclaimed the good news to you the first time. And though my physical condition was a trial to you, you did not hate or reject me. No, you welcomed me as a messenger of God, or even as Messiah Yeshua. So where is your sense of joy? For I testify that you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me, if possible. Now, this is how close Paul and these Gentiles became. Under some circumstance, whatever Paul's circumstance may have been, whatever circumstances were coming apart, he doesn't blame them for those things. They received him anyway. Whatever his physical condition was, whatever this was that was giving him a problem, they received him anyway. They welcomed him. They had compassion for him. They built a relationship of trust with him. And it sounds like, from reading this, it must not have been a pleasant or a good experience. But he says, it was this physical ailment that gave him the opportunity to speak to them for the first time. And that's a good reminder for us sometimes about life, how things go. That's even our worst moments, even our physical situations, physical ailments, those can still be moments that give us opportunity to share our faith. Sometimes it's our trials, and sometimes it's our sicknesses. They may not even necessarily be about us or be for us, but an opportunity for others, to hear the word, to practice their faith. Would there have been as great of a harvest among the Gentiles in Galatians without this physical ailment of Paul? Hard to say. But in some way, something happened. And he was able to speak to them. But now that he's left, he's moved on a little bit. He's had other journeys that he's been going on. Now, all of a sudden, it's like they don't trust Paul anymore. It's like they don't want to hear from him, like they don't want to accept his teaching or his leadership. All of a sudden, the Galatians question his motives. They question his qualifications. Those who wanted to force this circumcision. those who were rejecting the Jerusalem council, who have come into the group following after Paul, they have started to undermine him and tear down the things that he has taught. He says, have I, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, have I suddenly become your enemy by telling you the truth? He wants to remind them, he wants to let them know that, I'm standing for you. I've been fighting on your behalf in all of this stuff. I've been standing for the freedom of the gospel and the proper order of the covenants. But he's being accused by their enemy so that, no, that guy Paul, he's been wrong. He's been deceiving you. He's actually been keeping you from God. And he says, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? People don't always want to hear the truth, do they? They don't always want to be reminded that maybe the things that they believe or the things that they've been hearing or grown up with are wrong. I know I don't. I don't like it. But when the truth is the standard, we have to be willing to hear it. We have to be willing to consider it, to be willing to accept it. But personally, we have a problem with the truth sometimes. Is our culture having a problem with the truth these days? Yeah. This reminds me of a couple of quotes from George Orwell. He's the writer of 1984. Y'all might have seen these. It says, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Is that true of Paul's day? Very much so. He is telling the truth about the Gentiles and their place in God's plan of redemption. That was revolutionary for his day. And there's another one. It says, the further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those who speak it. Y'all been seeing that one? Are we seeing evidence of this one in our day, especially? Oh, yeah. Our society does not want to hear the truth, especially truth that comes from here. So the motives of those who are trying to undermine Paul, that's what really needs to be revealed. That's the truth that needs to be exposed. The people who are trying to tear him down and tear down what he's been teaching them, that's what needs to be addressed. Because it was happening all the way back then. It's the kind of thing that still happens today. He says, others zealously court you, and not in a good way. But they wish to shut you out so that you will court them. And to be courted is good, but let it always be in a good way, and not just when I am there with you. So these were men who were coming into an existing congregation. They were criticizing, undermining Paul, what he had taught them, how the congregation was this mix of Jew and Gentile, and they sought to push the Gentiles out. They wished to shut you out. Kick them out of the park, if you remember that analogy from a few weeks ago. Even though they already had their ticket, to be in the park, to the entrance. And if they get kicked out, if they get shut out of that fellowship, then those Gentiles will do anything they have to do. They'll even come and court after those ones that kicked them out. They'll try to get into their good graces. They'll try to get into their favor. They'll have to come back under their guidance to make the Gentiles dependent upon them, loyal to them. So somebody has come in and tried to essentially recruit these Gentiles to follow after them and to ignore what Paul has taught. And guys, that kind of stuff still happens today. It's been happening even in this congregation, as some of you know. Someone coming in for a while, getting to know each of you for the purpose of starting their own group. Enticing you to join that group meeting, which coincidentally starts at the same time as ours. Making it so you couldn't maintain fellowship with both, but had to choose one over the other. That's a very divisive practice. That is not in a good way. I've heard that called like sheep stealing and things like that. Anybody else heard that before? And it's not of God. So I'm thankful that our friendships and our relationships and our trust in each other is what God is doing is proving resistant to that. But we're not immune to it. We're not immune to that kind of thing happening. But again, understand this is what we've experienced is nothing new. The enemy has always wanted to divide and separate God's people from each other. And I know that's not fun to talk about, but it still happens. But even, Paul shifts to talk about what these dividers are actually teaching. They themselves want to be under the Torah. And especially want all the Gentiles to be under the Torah. That's where he goes next in chapter 4, verse 21. He says, "Tell me, you who want to be under the Torah." Now here we have, most of us didn't grow up with the Torah, right? And yet we have come in this direction. So coming under the Torah, that doesn't necessarily sound bad, does it? I mean, isn't obedience to God's Torah, His instruction, isn't that a good thing? Don't we want to live and organize our lives by God's Torah? Isn't that a demonstration of our love for Him? Right? Of course it is. That's what we teach. That's what I teach here at Restoration. The Torah is not just for the Jewish person, but for all who are part of God's household. Right? Because the Torah is what is a life that is pleasing to God. The Torah is how a redeemed person is supposed to live. God doesn't have one set of rules or one way of life for the natural branch and a different set of rules and a different way of life for the grafted in. If you're grafted into the same branch, you're all fed by the same source. Because if that were so, if it were true that He had a different way for the Jewish person and another way for the Gentile, then we could never become like Paul, as he had just told them to do earlier. The Jew and the Gentile would never look or act like family, never be one new man. So isn't intentionally placing ourselves under Torah, isn't that submitting to the Torah and our lives to the Torah? Yeah, that is. But herein lies the tricky part. And it describes or it shows the lie of the enemy and the false teaching that the enemy will do. Because the enemy will always include some truth in the deception. False teaching will always try to hide itself or mix in some true things, hoping that you mix or miss the error. That happened all the way back in the beginning, when the serpent came and spoke to Eve. He talked about the tree and the fruit of the tree, right? He played on the fact that, did God really say you should not eat of anything in the garden? Did God say that? More or less. It's pretty close. Almost right, but not quite. And her response was also almost right and not quite. So what does Paul mean by you who want to be under Torah? Again, he's talking about getting things out of order. If you want to be under Torah, for the Jewish person, there's the idea that because you are under Torah, because you've grown up with it, because you've been keeping the Torah, that must mean that you are right with God, that they are justified before Him. They've grown up with the Torah. They've lived this way. They've been God's people. They live a life trying to please Him. Because keeping the Torah, we talked about this last night, those are all signs and evidences that they are his. But what's the problem is when that happens, they have been elevating the Sinai covenant above or before the Abrahamic covenant. It's been making it, the Sinai Mosaic covenant, more important than the Mosaic or than the Abrahamic covenant. Because when you get to the Gentile, we can't come straight to Messiah by faith and just waltz in. That's the argument. Can you as a Gentile just come straight to Messiah, walk in as if you belong? So, and they're saying, no. You Gentiles, you have to demonstrate a change and a commitment first. These teachers wanted to shut them out, as what that previous passage talked about. Make them start over with that formal conversion process. Go through, what we talked about, Ty has mentioned about being an entire Torah cycle. So maybe at least a year. And start living under the Torah, start living under its guidelines, and then you can come to Messiah and be included in the fellowship. But that's getting things out of order. And Paul hits that hard with a very important question, because if this is what these Jewish teachers were thinking, that the Gentiles have to do all of that first, and if you Gentiles, if you accept that teaching, you who want to be under Torah, don't you understand the Torah? Paul is saying that they don't really understand the Torah or its teachings or the covenants or the reality of redemption and the plan and purpose of God. So those who are claiming to be teachers don't understand something that is supposed to be basic. They don't understand something that what they're talking about. They're getting the basics wrong. They can't even recite the ABCs, the Aleph Tav, correctly or in the proper order. And so he starts with something that should be very simple. Don't you understand the Torah? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and one by the free woman. Right? This should be pretty basic, especially if you've been reading the Torah. You hear about these people. But one, the son by the slave woman, was born naturally, while the other, the son by the free woman, was through the promise. Every Jewish person should know this, right? This is like the ABCs. Because he's talking about who? What two men is he talking about? The sons. Who are the sons? Ishmael and Isaac, right? The Jewish people who are undermining Paul would all identify themselves as which son? Oh, we are absolutely and certainly we are Isaac. And they're right in a sense. They would all identify them as the son born of the free woman, since they are those descendants from Isaac. But Paul actually flips it and turns it on them and shows what they are actually doing, what they are actually teaching and living, and they are believing more like Ishmael. He reminds them of the nature and the order of the covenant. So there are these two sons, one born of a slave woman, but one born of a free woman. Now these things are being treated allegorically, for these are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, and of course, when they hear that part, what would the Jewish people tend to think? Which one is which? Well, Mount Sinai, that's definitely representative of Isaac and the free woman, right? But what does he say? One is from Mount Sinai, giving birth to slavery. And this is Hagar. He flips the expectation. And I find it interesting that in this whole exchange, in this allegory, he mentions two covenants, but he only directly identifies the one. If you're asking the circumcision group, speaking allegorically, whose child is the Sinai covenant, the Mosaic covenant, which one does that belong with, Hagar or Sarah? They would say Sarah. But he identifies the one that the circumcision group most identifies with, the one that they take pride in, the one that they trust in the most, the one that defines their relationship and their walk with God. He says, no, actually, that's the Mosaic covenant. Is not the child of Sarah, but the child of Hagar. And he describes it not as a covenant of freedom, but a covenant of slavery. Understand, he's not ripping on the Mosaic covenant. He's not criticizing Sinai. He's not diminishing its importance. He's not saying that it's worthless or no longer relevant. But if the Mosaic covenant is out of place, if it is not in its proper order, if you try to make the Mosaic covenant the first, the most important or defining thing in your relationship with God, that then Mount Sinai, the Mosaic covenant, can be just as much a place of slavery as Egypt is. If keeping the Torah was required before leaving Egypt, then the Israelites would never have been brought out, and they'd still be in slavery. The Mosaic covenant is not how they were brought out of Egypt. The Mosaic covenant was not the way in which they were brought out of Egypt. The Mosaic covenant is not how or where our relationship with God, our redemption, that doesn't start with the Mosaic covenant. He says, but this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. See, the current situation in the world in this first century, where they are led by the Sanhedrin in the traditions of the elders in the present Jerusalem, he's saying, guys, they are still in a place of slavery because for them, the Torah has not fulfilled its purpose. For them, the Torah has not accomplished what it was designed to do, to lead them to help them to recognize the Messiah. Paul has already said that. He's already said that was the point and the purpose and the goal of the Torah. Back in chapter 3, he says the Torah became our guardian to lead us to Messiah, to help us identify the Messiah so that we might be made right or justified based on faith, based on trusting. But having the Torah, again, doesn't help you be justified if you reject the Messiah to whom it's all pointing to. Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, the rabbis, all of them, even with the Torah, are still in slavery to sin because they've not been set free by the Son. Those who are in Messiah, whether you are Jew or Gentile, you have a citizenship and a rightful place in the Jerusalem that is from above. Right? The Jerusalem above is free. And she is our mother. That is our source. That is our citizenship. Having the Torah doesn't help you be justified if you reject the Messiah. And the idea that there is a Jerusalem that is, that is on earth, there's one that is above, a heavenly Jerusalem, is one of the reasons why I and many others believe that there is a link between Paul and the author of Hebrews, because he's talking about the Jerusalem that is above. Hebrews 12 mentions the same type of thing. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that is above, and to myriads of angels, a joyous gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are written in a scroll in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous ones made perfect, and to Yeshua, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks of something better than the blood of Abel. So it's one of those things that could be a link between at least what Paul says and how he teaches with what is there in Hebrews, or it could be a sign that the idea and the concept of a Jerusalem that is above is a lot more widespread. I found this interesting statement on My Jewish Learning, just one of those introductory sites. It says, the concept of an ideal or heavenly Jerusalem appears to emerge in Jewish tradition in the 3rd century of the Common Era. There is a rabbinic homily in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, a leading rabbinic figure in Tiberias in the early 3rd century, who asserts, in part, that in the future, this is what's so interesting, in the future, the earthly and the heavenly Jerusalem will be reunited as one. Does that sound familiar to our hope at all? It says, this teaching is based on an exposition of Psalm 122, verse 3, Jerusalem built up, a city knit together. And according to the Midrash, knit together means the uniting of the earthly Jerusalem with the heavenly Jerusalem as one. However, the roots of this idea are found in the earlier Jewish thinking. It never really goes into what that earlier Jewish thinking is. But I have to think that it does come from a much earlier idea. Can y'all think of what it might be? The idea that there is an earthly Jerusalem and a heavenly Jerusalem? To me, it goes back all the way to the tabernacle, which Moses built from seeing a pattern of that vision of the heavenly tabernacle. Where he says, you are to raise up the tabernacle according to the plan which you were shown on the mountain. And so the logic goes something like this. If the tabernacle had a pattern or had a blueprint that modeled things for Moses, well, it's safe then to assume or interpret that, it's probably that the temple also, that was built later, also had a pattern. And if the temple had a pattern or a blueprint, then its placement within the whole city would have been planned out as well. So logically, there must be a Jerusalem in heaven in this perfect condition that's also in our future. So the question is, where do we want to live? Under which authority? How many of y'all have been through the process of buying a house? How many? Too many times, right? All right. When you bought a house, there's a trend of people doing a lot of things of sight unseen purchasing. Y'all heard about that? That is terrifying to me. To buying something sight unseen, because when you're going there to look at the place, you're not just looking at the property or the house, are you? Don't you check out the neighborhood that it's in? Don't you? A lot of people will look at the schools. They'll look at police reports. They'll compare the stats of the area and the neighborhood and crime and all those other types of things before they want to buy a house in that particular neighborhood. So if we're talking about the earthly Jerusalem and the heavenly Jerusalem, compare the stats for the earthly Jerusalem with the heavenly one. And where do you want to live? Where do you want to own a house? The stats and the plan for the one up in heaven is going to be a lot better than anything that's here on earth. He says, this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery. That's the stat. She is in slavery with her children. But again, the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. The Jerusalem above, that's where believers in Messiah are to consider themselves living. That's where we're supposed to live. We are the children of the free woman, of Sarah. So why do we want to move in with Hagar and live in her house? Why do we want to be counted not as Sarah's son, but as Hagar's son? Hagar was able to have children read through the scriptures, relatively easy. It happened naturally. All the while Sarah remained childless and bore the brunt of that scorn that her culture would have had for her. But Sarah had to wait for that fulfillment, had to wait for that joy, but her outcome in waiting is much better than anything Hagar has experienced. Sarah is going to have more and better children. Paul goes on, he says, "For it is written, Rejoice, O barren woman, who bears no children. Break forth and shout, you who suffer no labor pains. For more are the children of the desolate than the one who has a husband." And you think, how will she end up having more children? Hagar had one, Sarah had one, in that sequence. It takes continuing to read from Isaiah 54 in order to kind of see it, because he's quoting, this is verse 1 of Isaiah 54. But verse 2 continues like this. This is part of the promise. This is part of the expectation. He says in Isaiah 54 verse 2, it says, "Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch out your tabernacle curtains, do not hold back, lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. For you will spread out to the right hand and to the left. Your offspring will possess the nations and will resettle the desolate cities." Now, in other words, when you start a home project and you're enlarging the place of your tent, why would you do that? Children. For children, a lot of times. Don't you need to make room for more? This is the American equivalent of building on an extra bedroom. You're expanding the house because you're going to have an influx of additions to the family. And the promise is that the offspring, your offspring of the one who was once desolate and barren, your offspring will possess the nations. What is the gospel, the mystery of God? What that reveals is that this is because these new inhabitants, in many ways, will be coming from the nations, even from among the Gentiles. That's why some of the translations will say, some of you may have it here, your offspring will possess not the nations, but what? The Gentiles, the Goy. But either way, the Gentiles will be coming in, and they're going to need a place within the household. They're going to need to be covered under the protection of the tent and the tabernacle that you have set up. And that's the future. That's the promise that is being waited for. And that's the children that are being brought in and gathered from the nations. And children, that's what we are in the Messiah. He says in verse 28, he says, "Now you, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise." You guys are children, not like Ishmael, born the natural way. From which covenant? The Sinai covenant, the Mosaic covenant. You guys are like Isaac. You're children of the promise. That promise was the Abrahamic covenant. But the problem arises is because not everyone understands, not everybody accepts or likes the new addition to the family. It was a couple months ago that I had heard somebody who had some puppies and whatever else. We were wondering if, hey, maybe we should get another dog, because man is getting a little older. Be easier to have, maybe get one now. Man, it could maybe even train the little puppy or whatever else, and help it be house trained, all those other kind of things. And so we brought this puppy over for a couple hours. And how did it go? Did it go well? Did she accept this puppy very well? No, she did. She was just like, "What are you doing here?" And she kind of gave it the evil eye and just kind of tolerated it a little bit. It's like, "I don't think I like this." And it's like, "You guys are going to do something about that, right?" It was all over her face that she was not very happy that somebody new was coming in the house. And fortunately, we didn't keep the puppy for very long. I went back. It just didn't seem like that was going to be the place to be. But not everybody understands or accepts or likes the new addition to the family. And so what happens? In verse 29, it says, just as at that time the one born according to the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted the one born according to the Ruach, according to the Spirit. And so it is now, he says. It says, those of the circumcision group, those who are persecuting the Gentile believers, are trying to put them out of the fellowship and make them start all over and come back in. Those who were persecuting Paul for siding with them, he is saying they are not acting like children of the promise. They are acting more like and in the legacy of Ishmael. Now how do you think they would receive that statement or that word? Do you think they liked being called Ishmael? Those are pretty sharp words. And the truth is that of these two groups, this choice to be made between the circumcision group and the children of promise by faith, there is a choice you have to make between the circumcision group, which is Ishmael, and the children of promise by faith, the Gentiles who have been born by the Spirit of promise. If anyone is going to have to leave the fellowship, if anyone is supposed to be put out of the fellowship, who's it going to be? Ishmael or Isaac? It's not going to be the Gentiles. It's not going to be the sons of promise, because Torah has already established a pattern of what to do in this situation. Verse 30, what does the scripture say? Drive out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. He is saying very clearly, for those who need to understand the ABCs of the Torah, that only those who come in under the promise and the redemption of the Abrahamic covenant, only those are the ones who are saved. Only those are the ones who have an inheritance. And if anyone tries to come in the natural way, by their own works of Torah under the Mosaic Covenant, they don't have a place. If they think that the Torah is how they are justified before God, they have no inheritance with you. They have no salvation. They are children of Hagar and they are slaves still trapped in Egypt. They have never been redeemed. They have never been set free. That's the reality of the situation. Again, what does the slave woman, what does the scripture say? Drive out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son, only the free woman. So then, brothers and sisters, we are not children of Hagar, of the slave woman, but of Sarah, the free woman. And this is important, for us to know. The Gentiles should not see themselves as lesser or inferior. The Gentiles need to understand themselves as children of the promise, with a promised inheritance, just like the Jewish believers in Messiah are children of the promise and have an inheritance. So these Gentiles have more of a right to that promise. They have more of a right to that inheritance because they are in Messiah than those Jewish people who may have the Torah but don't have Messiah. And we need to understand that and believe that. But we don't replace the Jewish people. We don't have the same role or function necessarily that they do. We have positions within the family. But the Gentiles are not lesser than either. And so for those Gentiles who struggle with that, who are hearing that they are lesser than, who are hearing that they've got to start over, that they're not really saved until they come under the Mosaic Covenant. You need to hear Paul's conclusion to the matter. And it's harder to see because our chapters have broken it up. Because it's actually verse 1 of chapter 5. He says, "For freedom, Messiah set us free. So stand firm and do not be burdened by a yoke of slavery again." It's like when you come to Messiah, Jew or Gentile, you are free, and you are a child of the promise. You are a child of Sarah. You are a descendant of Isaac. And if you're trying to go back to this, you're putting yourself, and you're moving in with Hagar. And you're actually rejecting the promise. And so those who misunderstand where we are and what we are doing, this is modern day, right? Those who misunderstand where we are, who don't understand what we're doing, what do they think we're doing? They think we're doing this. They think that we're coming in underneath the yoke of slavery all over again, that we're coming to Mount Sinai and trying to earn our salvation. That's one of the first accusations that any of us ever hear, right? That we're putting ourselves back under slavery by keeping the Shabbat, by keeping the feast, and the dietary laws, or all those types of things. That's not what this passage is teaching at all. It's a statement about justification and getting the covenants in their proper order. Because there is a proper order. Right? They move and progress from one to another. You start where? You start with the first covenant of the Abrahamic covenant of redemption. But you're not supposed to just stop there. You move and you are taken out of slavery and you go to Mount Sinai, you go to the Mosaic Covenant, and you begin to live as the child of God. You believe. You're redeemed by the Abrahamic. Then you come to Torah. Because God's Torah is not a burden, is it? It's not too difficult for us, as Deuteronomy talks about. His ways are not slavery. They are a joy, and they are an expression of our love for Him. That's the proper order of things. Right? Because what comes next? You hear those theological words. If you're justified with the Abrahamic covenant, you're sanctified by the Mosaic covenant. What's next? You're glorified. And what covenant does that happen under? We see that revealed in the Davidic covenant, and the promises made to David and the Messianic king. And then we see all those promises fulfilled and completed in the new covenant. Right? So you're justified under Abraham, you are sanctified with the Mosaic, you are glorified with what you see in the Davidic, and then it all comes together, all three come together with the new. That's the proper order of things. And for those that try to say, hey, you're just going back and trying to be burdened by a yoke of slavery, who are they really acting more like? Are they acting making those accusations of us? Are they acting like a child of the promise? Or are they doing what this one says? One born according to the flesh persecutes the one that's born of the Spirit. They're acting more like Ishmael. So not everything has changed a whole lot. We still, in our beliefs, in our understanding of things, we still
need to get things in their proper order. But we need to also come to understand that God's ways, His Torah, His instructions, His sanctification for us is not the burden, it's the joy. And if it's not that for you already, I hope it becomes that soon. Because that is the life of a redeemed people. Amen?
Amen.